We're going to get started with panel number 4, New Harms, Old Torts. Please join me in welcoming via Zoom Marianne Franks from the University of Miami Law School. With us today in person are Joe Jerome from Meta Reality Labs, Eric Ramirez from Santa Clara University, and Jameson Spizak from the Future on Privacy Forum. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you, by the way, Britton and Ben, for the organization. I feel like, I learned not only a lot of new content today so far, but also learned a lot of questions I didn't even know I needed answers to, and this has been great. And I thought that today, our format, maybe we would start with a question and have everybody introduce themselves as you respond to this question. But also, if you have questions after we've said something, right? I think it would be good to hear from you if there are questions about harms or potential ways you might want to step in for regulation that we mention or that you think we don't mention. It would be useful to engage with you. So I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Eric Ramirez. I'm associate professor at Santa Clara University. I'm in the philosophy department. I also teach for the neuroscience program, and I run our experimental philosophy lab there. It's mostly VR, and actually it's all VR. And I thought it would be good to start today, right? The topic of our panel is new harms, old torts, and so it would be, I think, interesting if we all got a chance to say something about in that context, like what sorts of harms you are either most worried about, most interested in discovering or learning more about in terms of extended reality. And why don't we start with Professor Franks?
Apologies for having to be a disembodied head at this conference, but I'm delighted to be participating in this discussion. I'm Marianne Franks. I'm a law professor at the University of Miami School of Law, and I'm also the president and legislative and tech policy director of a nonprofit organization called the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. My focus really is on the intersection between civil rights and technology, and I'm particularly interested in the issues of free speech, privacy, and exploitation. And to answer the question, just to start off, I would say that the thing that I'm most concerned about, or the kinds of harms I'm most concerned about in extended reality, are the same concerns I have about reality generally, which could be, I think, condensed into one concern about recklessness. Many of you in the room are probably familiar with the concept of hostile architecture or exclusionary design. And what I would suggest that is the real concern I have about legal frameworks, physical spaces, virtual reality spaces, augmented reality, is that we're suffering from a kind of reckless architecture and a reckless design, by which I mean really the kind of tendency to create substantial and unjustified harms for other people in the kind of pursuit of our own self-interest. And I call it reckless to distinguish it from hostile or intentionally exclusionary design, because I think most of what we're looking at in terms of the problems here are problems almost of thoughtlessness rather than intentional malice. There's a kind of presumption of the default user of who it is that we think will be able to make use of these products. And correspondingly, there is not very much acknowledgement of people who have been historically marginalized or burdened or discriminated against in real spaces. There's not enough focus on how spaces should be designed for them. And just to take an example that I'm sure will develop more throughout the discussion, one of the first things we heard about as the metaverse began sort of encroaching upon everybody's reality are accusations or allegations of sexual harassment, right? So one of the first things that apparently some users have done in virtual reality is try to figure out ways to make women feel as uncomfortable as possible. And it's not just that is a tendency that we see with every technology when it emerges, because that's been around since a rape in cyberspace, 1993, Julian Dibble's account in a very sort of rudimentary form of virtual community there. But it's also the response of those who are failing in some ways to recognize that this was going to be a problem. That is, when Meta was told about this problem, this is a big deal, this person was virtually groped, Meta's response is, oh, this person should have activated this shield that is possible. as opposed to making it a default, as opposed to making it something that was programmed into the design of the space and the experience. And there's really, at this point, no excuse for it. There was a case back in 2016, virtual reality game, where a woman, someone who had presented as a woman, had explained that she had felt not only all the wonderful experiences of what it meant to experience this kind of virtual reality in the game, but that as soon as she was sexually assaulted in this game, of course, that also felt very real. And there was this very strange response of, we care very much about the verisimilitude of these spaces and these games when it's positive things, right? Oh, it really feels like you're falling off a cliff, or you're really putting on armor, or whatever the case may be. But when it's, oh, you were sexually assaulted in virtual reality, well, that's not really real. So my main concern is this: it's that thoughtlessness, that tendency to design structures for people who have always had power, who have always been able to navigate these spaces with their interests sort of already in mind, and that we're not taking the time to think about all the ways historically that we have seen new spaces, new products, new ideas are always used against those who are most vulnerable. So that would be the really broad-based concern I have. Recklessness as a general kind of design concept, a lack of interest in those who are burdened by people's discriminatory and exploitative interests, and in particular, the kinds of harms that will mean for women and people at the intersection of multiple subordinated forms of discrimination.
Thank you. Why don't we go from stage left to right this way?
Hi, everyone. My name is Joseph Jerome. I am a policy manager within Reality Labs at Meta, where I cover what is known as sort of our XR portfolio, so that's sensor technologies. I like to say I'm a recovering lawyer. I actually am going to mark 10 years as a privacy professional this month, which is a little bit terrifying. And I've bounced around from a number of organizations, including the Future of Privacy Forum, as well as Common Sense Media and the Center for Democracy and Technology. And in that time, I've become really, really excited about the potential of immersive technologies and what it means for sort of the future of technology. To get to the question, though, at Meta, so we think about the risks into, I think, about 3 or 4 general buckets. And I think this is going to echo a lot of what Professor Franks just said, and I imagine what Jameson will also say, in that we see that there are, with respect to XR, there are risks around privacy, around safety and integrity, and then equity and inclusion. And so with privacy, this has come up as a theme over and over again today. We're dealing with novel types of data and more of it, or at least that seems to be the generalized concern from folks. And that while all of this is not individually all that unique, the synthesis of all of this sensor data into one sort of consumer device is raising new concerns. And so, part of, I think, my role here is we have to try and address misconceptions about how the technology works. We have a lot of work to do to just educate developers about how to handle privacy and to take data seriously. And then, one of Meta's key goals is to be transparent. And I really think what we're dealing with here is a lot of old issues in new forms. To give a demonstration, if I were to pull out my phone right now, and just want to celebrate myself and the fact that I'm on stage and take a picture of you all, you might think I'm being egotistical, but it probably doesn't alarm you. Now, say I want to take a picture of you with my glasses. What do I do? Does that make you feel uncomfortable? And what do I do to alleviate that discomfort? If I give a voice command, would that make it better? If I go with my hand here and sort of take a picture, does that make you feel better? So I just took a picture of you all with my glasses, which may or may not make you feel uncomfortable, but it's functionally the same as having just taken it with a phone. And I went and was trying to be very forthright about what I was doing. And so that goes to my transparency component of, we really think that there's the need to sort of establish norms. And that's going to be really important for safety and integrity and to resolve concerns around that. Because the reality is, there's been a lot of sort of subtle undertones about this in our conversations today. People are not going to want to use VR headsets, AR glasses, BCIs, any of this technology in experiences if they do not feel safe. And so how we sort of make people feel safe, there's obviously a lot to learn from Professor Franks and others, but it's a long process. At Meta, it has sort of begun by creating things like our code of conduct in virtual experiences. But we also have to recognize that, as a social media company, we have a lot of experience dealing with, content moderation, but immersive technologies go beyond content to conduct. And that just establishes a baseline. We still have to offer tools and other mechanisms to sort of create the facilitation of norms. And that leads finally to sort of our larger concern around equity and inclusion. A couple of folks have mentioned how a lot of this technology is designed for people like me, white guys, interpupillary distance, stuff like that came up at the start of this morning's conversation. We shouldn't deny that this technology is being designed for certain demographics in mind, and for it to be successful, it's going to have to be designed for everyone. And so I guess I'll just say, this is my plug, that I'm really happy I get to be here today and to geek out with all of you about this technology. It's a lot of fun. And it's also, I think, one of the best things that we do at the Meta Policy team is I get to come here and geek out with you guys and take back what I've learned and what your concerns are, and to try and make our products a little bit better. Meta has said since we rebranded that the metaverse isn't something we're going to build by ourselves, and I think that's accurate. I think everybody in this room has a role to play. I think all sorts of other companies have roles to play. Standard-setting organizations, civil society all have really important roles to play. And the only way we're going to get this right is when people express their concerns, articulate what they are, and then we sort of can craft solutions together. So I think it's sort of pushed back against the notion of identifying harms, but I think it's sort of a group project that's going to be necessary to resolve this sort of stuff.
Harms and areas of concern and work, right?
Yeah.
Hey everyone, my name is Jameson Spivak. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Future of Privacy Forum in DC, where I focus on the privacy implications of immersive technologies. So XR, immersive gaming platforms, brain-computer interfaces, things like that. Before joining FPF, I was at the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law, where I studied the use of algorithmic technologies in the criminal legal system, so risk assessment scoring, predictive policing, but I really focused on face recognition technology and policy around that. So as you can imagine, the thing that I'm going to bring up is data privacy. And so as a lot of people before me have already said, XR relies on large volumes and varieties of data. Sensor data about our bodies, about our environments, data from our devices about what we're doing on these devices, our precise and approximate geolocation data. And altogether, this data provides a really intimate view of our interests, our behaviors, our medical, whether it's physical or mental health conditions. And in the wrong hands, this could be used to make discriminatory decisions or other harmful decisions about people. So what I'm interested in thinking about and looking at are like, well, what are the legal implications of this? So in the US, at the federal level, our privacy laws, we don't have a comprehensive federal privacy law. Our privacy laws are sectoral, so they're limited to pretty specific contexts. So if your healthcare provider is using XR, it would be covered by HIPAA. If it's used in the classroom, it could be covered by FERPA, but there's not a general comprehensive privacy law to cover the kinds of data that might be collected. A few states, such as the one we're in right now, California, have comprehensive privacy legislation, but notably, the framework is usually a notice and consent framework for this kind of legislation. So the company provides notice that they're collecting or using or sharing certain data. You check a box, you click a button, you put on a headset, and you have consented to this practice. Okay, what about biometric privacy laws? This data a lot of it is body-based. It's about our bodies. It's collected from our bodies. It's making inferences about or judgments about our bodies. Is that biometric data? Well, as Britton will tell you, it is legally speaking usually not considered biometrics because it is not usually linked to identification, and biometrics laws are typically tied to identification purposes. There may be some exceptions to this. So BIPA, the Biometric Information Privacy Law in Illinois, if you look at the case law, there's been a few cases where people have alleged that AR try-on apps, so where you get to try on glasses or makeup. They have alleged that this is biometric data based on how the statute defines biometrics as including facial scans, and the app uses facial scans. These cases have been settled, so they haven't reached a decision, but it's possible that there are certain cases in which this data will be treated as a biometric. But generally speaking, it's probably not going to be. So beyond this, what about looking at tort law? What about the privacy invasion torts? Usually what will happen is that XR providers in their terms of service or in their end user agreement will disclaim any liability for the company for how what data is collected and used. When the user puts on the headset or when they check a box, they're consenting to that collection and that use. And usually it'll be pretty hard to, if someone else within the if another user is violating your privacy, it's going to be hard to name a defendant because, as Professor Volek talked about earlier with the Bangladesh problem, it's going to be really hard to find a defendant. So oftentimes people will go after the platform itself, but usually that will not work out because they have disclaimed liability in the terms of service. So that's kind of just a general outline of how I see the legal implications of the data collected in XR.
Thanks, Jameson. And so for my time, I think I want to, agree with everyone, which is, I'm a philosopher, this is a rare thing. But I want to follow up on some of the things I heard from all the panelists and maybe add a way in which I think harm might happen in extended reality context that we've brushed up on. I think actually Jeremy brushed up on it a little bit in his keynote, I think I heard in panels 1 and 3 a little bit as well, and it has to do with the way that bodies can matter in extended reality. Not just about data privacy, right? And in fact, Professor Franks, right, as you mentioned, the way that we can experience things that happen to our bodies in extended reality can matter in ways that we aren't fully ready to regulate or in some cases I think even understand well. And I want to give you some examples because I think these things work differently for virtual reality than they do for augmented reality, at least the way we understand them now. With virtual reality, I think we've already had this, right, Professor Franks, you mentioned this very, very public incident that happened in 2016, right, about sexual harassment in the metaverse, and that we can experience things that happen to our bodies, at least in some cases, as being sufficiently similar to real life experiences that we already want to regulate against, at least at the psychological level, that I think that needs an urgent kind of concern that it isn't currently getting. But I also think we're learning a couple other things about how we understand what we are, actually, and when we embody things in these spaces. So let me just give you one set of examples. These are both, these are not my studies, these are from, her name is Gula Freeman, she's at Clemson. She does a lot of really interesting research on embodiment. And this paper in particular is called My Body, My Avatar. It was this really interesting kind of virtual ethnography about how people experience themselves if they get to control really precise parameters about an avatar they create and then live in for a moment. And I think what we see in that kind of research is that people can take their virtual selves and virtual bodies to be at least as important as their physical selves and their physical bodies. And in some cases, you can even feel a conflict between those. I wanted to make sure I quoted this correctly because she was quoting one of her subjects who actually had a pretty transformative experience as a result of this study. So this is what she said about her experience. She said, by using a feminine female avatar, I found that I was just more comfortable with that body. And it's kind of what I learned about my identity. That was the evidence to myself to consider which direction I wanted to take my actual body outside of VR. If I found I was happy in VR about my body and I was not happy with my body outside of VR, why not change it? And for this particular person, this meant undergoing gender confirmation, right? Like modifying the physical body to be more like this virtual body that they had inhabited. And we see something similar with augmented reality. So you mentioned, Jameson, the kind of L'Oreal Cosmetics thing, and I think that's my go-to right now for AR examples is AR overlays, right? Snapchat overlays that change your appearance, usually for things either for fun, you make yourself a cat, or to conform to like gender norms about beauty, right? That's what we use these overlays for. But if you're sort of swim in the same academic circles as I do, maybe you came across the kinds of articles I started coming across in the last couple of years about some phenomenon that's being referred to sometimes as Snapchat dysmorphia, sometimes it's Zoom dysmorphia, right, as a particular subcategory of body dysmorphic disorder. And it results, right, from, and if you didn't know this, right, Zoom has filters that allow you to touch up your appearance. I think it says improve my appearance, it might be the way it calls it. And this results, right, when you get a mismatch between the way you see your physical self and the way you see your augmented reality self that causes dysphoria. And so I think what this points to is that the way that we embody ourselves, either in AR with overlays or creating avatars in virtual spaces, can actually have real effects on our sense of self, but also have psychological effects on us. So this is, I think, not just adding to questions about control, right? Who should control representation in these spaces if representation can matter that much, but also data privacy issues, right? How we choose to tailor our avatars might actually be really meaningful, deep information about us that we might want to protect, but also that we can respond to things that happen in these spaces in ways that really look like what we would respond to in physical spaces. So that's where I've been thinking about so again, I'm a philosopher, so the metaphysical questions about identity, but also the ethical questions about how we treat each other in certain kinds of social spaces. And I thought maybe this would be a good opportunity, since this is one set of questions here. If there were questions, comments, concerns that you wanted to raise about anything that we've said now, we could stop and have a conversation.
I've learned a great deal today, so thank you to all the speakers. But I'm relatively new to some of the details of these topics. For instance, how does biometric data is regulated? How does that compare with HIPAA?
Sorry, could you repeat that? How does it?
So you mentioned the regulation of biometric data. But it sounds like the definition of biometric data is very limited compared to all of the different types of data that we've heard about that can, in fact, identify an individual. So I'm wondering, okay, HIPAA has been around for a while. How do the constraints of HIPAA compare to the constraints on the current definition of biometric data in terms of how it's gathered, processed, stored, et cetera?
Yeah, so a caveat that I'm not an expert on HIPAA or biometric privacy law, but So HIPAA covers data in the context of your healthcare provider. Biometric data is broader than that, and it also it's not just in the healthcare context, but it varies by state. So there's, someone said earlier, 4 states that have biometric laws, I believe. The most prominent one being Illinois, that has the BIPA privacy law, Biometric Information Privacy Act. And the way that BIPA defines biometrics is that it generally speaking ties it to identification. So data about your body, or that is collected from your body, is not necessarily considered biometrics unless it is or can be used for identification purposes. And so I can't speak for how exactly HIPAA defines it, but that is how BIPA, that's how BIPA defines it, and other biometric laws are similar in that they tie biometric to identification.
The reason why I ask, I'm familiar with HIPAA. Thank you. The reason I ask is I am familiar with HIPAA, but I'm alarmed by all the things I've learned today. I mean, just from the iris, what you can learn about an individual and identify an individual. Has anyone considered applying HIPAA to all these new types of data?
So let me jump in, and not as a representative of Meta so much as a former lawyer. So I think HIPAA is incredibly limited. There's actually, I think, a pretty interesting report that from 2014, that was authored by both the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Health and Human Services that sort of talked about the sort of overlap between general consumer protection privacy laws and HIPAA. And the reality is, like, outside of the healthcare provider context, HIPAA doesn't apply. So health and wellness apps aren't governed by HIPAA. And so when we're talking about all of the data streams generated by XR technologies, if they're not being used in the context of like health treatment in a health system, so, you know, at a hospital by a doctor, it's not,
Right.
that law isn't applicable.
I understood that, but I thought, well, there are these limitations already on the books for medical, in the medical arena. Why not apply those to these other new forms of data that are very intimate?
Well, I mean, that's like I guess, Britt, we should have had there should be a panel here about XR and the role of federal privacy legislation. We don't have a federal privacy law that does that.
So then I could move us to another question, which is in part, right, it's just to connect it to this actually, and this is going to overlap a little bit with the panel before ours, but it's a question about like who's best positioned to handle these kinds of problems, right? In the first panel, I think we heard some responses that it should be individual users maybe should have all these controls that allow them to respond to certain kinds of potential threats or concerns or harms. And I think over the day, we've heard some other possible answers, either like communities of users, right? Something like a Reddit model where like communities spawn that control themselves, or corporations can tailor to their particular, right, either desired user base or to their users, some set of controls or moderation principles, maybe states, right? But in this case, right, given all of the levels of possible intervention, what kinds of problems do you think different forms of agencies or bodies are best positioned to regulate if we're worried about harm, right? If we're trying to prevent these things from happening, where do you think, let's say, individual users or Meta or the US government or a consortium of countries, right? Like what's best positioned to address certain kinds of problems?
Can I weigh in on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think one useful categorization here is focusing on the kinds of technology and the kinds of products that are self-oriented versus the kinds that are other-oriented. I think that there may be a lot of ways where we can take refuge in the idea that just providing more user control can solve a lot of problems when it comes to things that are really focused on your own experience. The concern I have, though, is that these are mostly going to be tools and products that are really useless to people who are concerned about being the part of someone else's fantasy or the object of their unwanted attention, right? So we can think about how you can have all the protections you want in a virtual reality or augmented reality space, but if the person who is being recorded or whose identity is being used or appropriated in some way does not even want to be there at all, under no terms, right? This is a person who doesn't want to appear in your virtual reality fantasy. If we don't have a way of dealing with that, that's a massive failure in itself. And this gets at, I think, one of the larger themes here, which is the sense of kind of technological inevitability, right? That everybody has to be part of these communities or part of these tools. And the only question is how to do it. And I think as long as that's our approach, it's always going to be inherently exploitative. No one should have to feel that they need to safeguard themselves from being invoked in someone's virtual reality, sexual assault scenario, or be subjected to someone taking surreptitious photographs of them, or worse yet, what Meta is doing with Eagle 4D, which is this constant kind of recording of the people around you without, as it was pointed out, as soon as they launched the project, as a reporter asked, what are the privacy controls that you're going to have? And Meta says, that's going to happen down the line. So this is exactly not the right way to do it. And it does, I think, really underscore how you can't let the people who are profiting from this be the ones in charge. That's the worst possible approach we could have. It'd be wonderful if there were some guidelines that responsible companies wanted to take up, but it shouldn't be optional. We do need to have a kind of radically different way of thinking about these technologies in the sense that people shouldn't have to deal with them if they don't want to. There needs to be a way for people to not fundamentally find themselves opted in and find a way to get out, but that there needs to be a presumption that if you want to participate in this kind of technology, you need to take affirmative steps to opt in. So I think, again, the entire approach of just saying, we already have this thing, now what do we do to maybe mitigate some of the harms that have become public, that's completely backwards. These products, these services should be subjected to extensive testing, whether that's called equality testing or harms testing or something of that nature, to ensure that they're not being rolled out to the public in ways that are just fundamentally unsafe, right? I'm thinking about the FTC Section 5 definition of unfair practices, right? causing some kinds of irreparable injuries that are not justified by their benefits, there needs to be some kind of preemptive way to get at some of these problems and not leave it up to either the corporations that really want to make money from these products or from individual users who have either opted in or not opted in. That can't possibly be the solution. There has to be something stronger, more robust, and more meaningful than that.
I think I saw a question, but I want to see if our panelists want to jump in at all yet.
So I'll just say that I was talking a lot about how I think it's really important, or we think it's really important to develop norms in the metaverse, and that's a process. You know, the fundamental challenge that we have is that there's not a perfect mechanism that exists to enforce and control against all potential harms in the metaverse, or you know, that requires a tremendous amount of trading off privacy, and it comes at pretty great costs of monitoring people all the time. So you know, our approach right now is to to lean into sort of a collaborative approach to metaverse governance. That sort of takes into account like what do users want, what are creators interested in, what do developers want, and you know, on our Horizon platform, for example, I think there's going to be a range of worlds that range between being fully open and being more closed, and each of those worlds will have different rules and different, you know, sort of community expectations. You know, in the longer term, I think it's a little, you know, your initial question, I think honestly, it's a little bit of A, a little bit of B, and a little bit of C. Everybody's going to play a role here. I think there's a tremendous appetite and room for cross-industry collaboration here. At Meta, we're a part of the Metaverse Standards Forum, which I'll flag for folks. They actually have a privacy, security, and identity working group that is kicking off next week. You know, I'll also flag that, you know, in industry we have the XR Association that has sort of brought together industry groups to sort of think about security and safety, and there are other forums like that, and I think those will play really important roles. And obviously, I think a number of the folks in this room play an important role of you know, critiquing and looking over what we produce in the process.
Yeah, and I guess just before the question, I'll add, I do always worry about. I understand the need for giving users control over their environment. But I also think that's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, I think it will mean some users will just be overburdened with this because they will have to respond to certain kinds of harassment just much more than others. And so for some, it might be a useful tool. For another one, it might just make existing in a space impossible. But I think the same tools also have that other edge, which is that it can be used in ways that we don't normally use tools in physical spaces. So. I think in the first panel, right, we had an example of somebody wearing like an offensive symbol on their avatar in some space, and empowering users to erase that person on the basis of that offensive symbolism, I think is a strange thing to do, since we don't want that in physical spaces, right? We sort of agree that if and Mark, this is just a random example. If I just hated purple, right, I wouldn't want to be able to just bloop you out of my existence.
I might do this to you now, though.
And then the communication just dies there, right? That there's something about the way we treat these privately owned public spaces that creates a regulative and legislative like quagmire, both in physical spaces, right? San Francisco is just full of privately owned public spaces that are usually parks or something that a corporation agrees to build so that they can get more apartments in the building they want to put up, but they're privately owned.
I think you know, one thing that we're going to struggle with in VR already is how much do physical real world analogies apply in virtual spaces, yeah. And then I think that gets even harder in augmented reality when. You know, and there's already lessons to be learned when we had, say, you know, Pokemon Go was, Pokestops were appearing in Holocaust museums or on private people's houses.
Exactly.
So, you know, the metaverse and the internet is unique in the sense that it offers this opportunity to sort of build a new world, but we latch on to sort of real world analogies, and I think we're going to want to try and bring some of that in. Where and when and how we do that is an open question.
Yeah, you would think there could be a follow-up panel of new harms, new torts, right? Like, but there was a question in the audience. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you ever think about Oh, okay. Hi. Do you ever think about the question of more and more personal data being held by various corporations and the implications for the public good nature of data? I worry about this because, again, building on what you just said, Joe, nice to meet you. In the past, like census was the bulk of personal information, anonymized, governments held the bulk. But today, and especially with metaverses, firms will hold the bulk of personal data. And it's probably true right now. What are the implications of that for using data to try to understand society better? Solve wicked problems. Thank you.
I mean, I think there are big implications. I guess I would point at, maybe not to throw Jameson under the bus, I think the Future of Privacy Forum has been exploring, how we sort of unlock the power of corporate data in research contexts. I know other organizations, like, again, the Center for Democracy and Technology has looked at that. And there's certainly legislative proposals that would, drag data out of companies, which are perhaps worth exploring and thinking about.
Yeah, the thing Joe's mentioning is that we are working on a project, not me personally, but my colleagues at the Future of Privacy Forum are working on a project to try to allow data sharing for researchers to be able to do research on discrimination and really important research with companies who wouldn't necessarily want to share their data because it's proprietary or for whatever reason. And so that they can do the research into the things that you're talking about to see what the impact of it is. But yeah, it's a tricky question.
And I think there's a question over there too.
Hi, so do you see any new challenges arising from the implementation of advanced haptics? Think of haptic suits, omnidirectional treadmills, and so on.
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think there's an interesting question even before haptics about assault in VR. So a lot of the research that does exist shows that when someone is assaulted in VR, that the effects are similar physiologically and mentally to when someone is assaulted in the physical world. But I don't think that the courts and the general public are likely to see assault in VR as analogous to physical world assault. I think they're probably likely to see it more as similar to online behavior or gaming, in-game behavior. And so I don't think that they would be likely to recognize like assault as a tort or criminal law, whatever. They might see it as intentional infliction of emotional distress, but probably not assault. But when you add haptics to the equation, it becomes easier to make the case, I think, that there is physical contact and that it would be considered assault.
So maybe with the time we have left, I can shift us from talking about the law and regulation and maybe think about ethics and character, right? So we're thinking about what do you think the kind of best practices for developers, both I think commercial but also experimental, right? If you're developing experiments as well, I think you need to have design principles in place to avoid this kind of harm or mitigate this kind of harm. What makes for what's the right term here? A good engineer or designer of these spaces? What kinds of things do you want them thinking about or working into their workflow?
So I'll try and start quickly. So I'll just to let this audience know, so Meta has a set of 4 general responsible innovation principles, which I guess I'll make a plug and suggest that's a place to start. And those principles include, putting people first. So as you're developing technology, like identifying how it's going to help people, offer meaningful controls. Obviously, you have to discuss what that looks like. Consider everybody, which again is why I think I'm really fortunate to be able to come to an event like this and understand different folks' concerns. And then to never surprise people. I think there's been a lot of conversation today about just We need more information, and we need to be more transparent, and that probably doesn't solve for everything, but it does something. And I think those are a good starting point for developers. I mean, one thing I think we need to realize and step back from here is, whether it's safety issues or privacy issues, a lot of attention, deservedly so, comes on big companies and big platforms. But a lot of the problems happen from smaller entities. And in this space, whether it's smaller VR developers, creators that are getting involved in AR, these are smaller entities that oftentimes don't think about this type of stuff. And so, it's a tough balancing act of how much responsibility should be on them, what can we do to educate them more to sort of have their own ethos. But there is sort of this reality that, as much as the big players are building these technologies, there's a lot of little guys out there that are going to be equally important to building this who probably aren't thinking about the ethics of it all yet.
So I think there's a number of things that developers can do to protect privacy. So one, on-device processing and storage. Avi talked about this earlier. And not just, sorry to pick on you, Joe, for a second, not just storing the raw image data of your eyes, for example, but also the data that is derived from that and the processed data beyond just the raw data. Data minimization and purpose limitation, so limiting the data that you collect and process to very specific purposes, and requiring or getting consent before you use it for other purposes. Privacy enhancing technologies like end-to-end encryption or differential privacy. Protecting bystanders by default, so an automatic, for VR and AR, an automatic blurring of bystanders' faces so that they're not captured by the cameras. User controls, third-party data policies, so making sure that developers are complying with the platform's policies around data collection and use. And then just having really strong cybersecurity practices so that this potentially really sensitive data is not hacked and stolen and used for nefarious purposes.
Yeah, and I'll say on my end, I mean, I haven't been doing this work at the sort of commercial level, but we've been thinking about and putting through codes of ethics aimed at IRBs, right? So institutional review boards that have to approve research on human subjects, just because at the moment anyway, you can do almost any experiment in VR, even if you couldn't replicate it with a physical scenario because it would be too traumatic or too potentially disturbing or anxiety provoking. And just the way I think that we apply things like the Belmont principles to assess risk, to assess harm, we really need to update it to make more sense of the fact that we can respond realistically to simulated content than just treat it as simulated and therefore of non-moral significance when we experiment on people. And I think in general, this is something that we should apply more widely. I'm not pointing to you, Joe, I'm just pointing in general to the Bay Area here. And you can just avoid certain kinds of problems even at the commercial level of accidentally harming your users, right? Your consumers. You don't want to do that. And so just assessing risk can change, especially the more we learn about presence. So Kent, I think you had this giant, really good slide about the factors that go into presence. And I think there are equal kinds of things we can think about at the actual design and hardware level that go into presence and generating it. And maybe we want to sometimes get less presence if the situation might actually be traumatic to experience, right? So trying to figure out what things we can slide in terms of design features is got to be important when we assess risk in this way. But I think we might be out of time. Britton, are we good on time or are we?
Give Professor Franks the last word.
Professor Franks, please.
Just because this may not be the best way to end the panel, but I do want to just mark that this is always such a strange conversation to hear over and over again about how, what are the good principles that these companies could come up with. When we're in 2023 and we've seen the Facebook files, we've seen tons of information about Twitter, we know what they know to some extent. Right now, we'll never actually know all the things that major companies know, but the idea that we still need to ask academics and other experts to say, hey, what are the kinds of things these companies could be doing better? we all know that they know what they could be doing better, and they choose not to in many cases, not always, but in many cases because it doesn't fit the profit motive. So I think that as very well and good as it might be to try to hope for benevolent dictators in the social media and virtual reality spaces, the real answer, I think, at this point, given 20 years of essentially tech industry immunity for causing extraordinary harms ranging from harassment to terrorism to murder, to insurrections and the downfall of democracy, I think at this point, really the question has to be, how do we change industry incentives? And a huge part of that question has got to be, what can the law do? What kinds of regulations really can be in place? Section 230 immunity may have to be a big part of this conversation, but just to put down a marker for saying this is an odd conversation to be having year after year after year after these harms have been known for many years, and that these companies like Meta, like Twitter, like Google, know more about our behavior and what might change our behavior than any of us do. And so the fact that we keep running into these problems and having these perfectly predictable harms result, I think at some point demands something better than a question about what are the kinds of standards they should have, and start being about how do we actually make it so that these companies can't just do what they want.
Great. I think that's a great way to end on that note, actually. So thank you, everybody.